to start with that video clip to give you a sense for what I'm going to talk about today. Pull this up here. All right, technology is going to agree with me right now. I appreciate the opportunity to come today. I wish I could stand up here and tell you that that video clip that I just showed you was Hollywood, that it was pure theatrics, that they took reality and embellished it and made it a whole lot worse than reality. I can honestly stand here and tell you reality was a whole lot worse than what you just saw. A simple fact that most of those troops that they showed being worked on were on litter up off the ground, and in reality everybody was on the ground. We had probably 8 or 9 stretchers, and everybody else you were treating in the dirt outside an aid station, probably no bigger than your garage. And you'd say, how in the world did a pediatrician end up in that setting? What's the path? How did you find yourself there? And I asked myself that question many times. And let me just put it into a little bit of context. And then share with you some stories that I've really taken away from this. You'll see the title, Lead from the Front. And I would tell you before I stepped on the plane in late March of 2004, about 1 year after the initial invasion of Iraq, and you said, Dave Mathias, do you know how to lead? I'd say, yeah, I was a captain of a basketball team. I was a cross-country runner. I've done well in school. Yeah, I know what leadership is all about. And I can honestly tell you, I think I knew very little. Of all the experiences that I took out of that year in Iraq, probably the greatest was getting to serve with some pretty phenomenal men. And I'm going to tell you about one in particular. You'll see the subtitle there, and you're going, who's Lancer 6? Any vets, prior service guys here? Anybody in the room? All right, please give a round of applause for these guys. Thank you. So if you've served and you've used a radio communication on the ground, every guy in the battalion, especially in the leadership team, has a call sign. So our battalion, we're known as the Lancers. Lancer 6 is the commander of the battalion. And in my case, I was privileged to serve under a man named Lieutenant Colonel Gary Valesky. I'm going to tell you a lot about him today, and the fact that I got to spend a year in the lab with him. And he didn't know it, and I probably didn't know it at the time, but the 15-year perspective on that experience has left me completely changed and impacted in some pretty profound ways. And I'd love for you guys to walk out of here today and say, yeah, I could take away maybe one nugget from that experience. And that's what I'd love to convey to you today. So how does a pediatrician get into combat? Well, this is a picture of me getting ready to ground convoy up from Kuwait. So we landed kind of mid-March, again 1 year after the initial invasion. And this is the morning that we're leaving, getting ready to convoy about 2 days up to Baghdad, and literally weapon locked and loaded for the first time. That's a gut check. What was even worse is I'm back in the back of a field ambulance, and if it looks like once those doors close I can't see anything, you're absolutely right. You're back in the back of this vehicle that's bouncing all over, and just before we loaded up, my platoon sergeant said, hey doc, you know that those sides of that ambulance are only Kevlar, so they won't even stop a 7.62 round coming in. Thanks a lot, appreciate that. So I can't see where we're going, and you're telling me that anybody can shoot through there. Well, after about 2 days and our first death, we rolled into Camp War Eagle on the northeast side of Baghdad. And you'd say, how does a death happen when you're convoying? Well, we had a young soldier fall asleep at the wheel and roll his vehicle. And so we walked in and had a memorial service on day 1. And already guys are looking at each other saying, yeah, we're going to the safest place on earth in Iraq, but this is not a safe operation by any means. And at that point, Lieutenant Colonel Valesky says, hey guys, that's the last one. That's the last guy that we're not going to bring home alive. And so over the next couple of days, we're learning our bearings. This is the command center in the middle of our camp. And I'm learning how not just to be a doctor, I've been trained to do that, but how to operate in this environment with military leaders who, a battalion commander in an infantry battalion knows how to do everybody's job in the room except mine. He knows how to be a soldier, he knows how to operate a weapon, he knows how to call in a medevac, but he doesn't know how to be a doc. And for some commanders, that's a stressful situation for them. They like control. That's really how they're wired. And I had heard stories of battalion commanders who really struggled with the fact that their doc could do things that they couldn't do, and in some situations that led to a lot of conflict. I can tell you I was blessed to be on the opposite end of that spectrum, a man who totally entrusted me, totally had confidence in me beyond what he should have, because somehow I got through medical school and residency and had never once seen a gunshot wound. Usually on some sort of ER rotation or surgery, you see somebody who's been shot. Never seen it. And we're in the safest place in Iraq. So we're talking about nation building. That's really the main goal. Okay, so you're in a section of Baghdad called Sadr City. If you look at it on a map, and you could pull it up right on your smartphone, Baghdad looks like kind of a regular city on the map, except in that northeast corner, there's a big rectangle that looks like it's on its corner. And that is an area that was built historically by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam built this area to bring Shiite Muslims up from the south to work menial labor. So as a Sunni in charge of the government, he says, yeah, fine, we'll bring these Shiites up to work the garbage jobs that nobody else wants. And if you look closely at Google Earth, you'll see that the boulevards that go north and south, east and west in Sadr City are very wide for one purpose, so he could roll his tanks up and down and crush any sort of rebellion or uprising that they would think to do, and he did it regularly. So when the U.S. went in 2003 and we said, hey, if anybody's going to be our friend on the ground, it's going to be those Shiite Muslims who've been crushed over the last number of decades. And they were right for a time. So when we rolled into Camp War Eagle the end of March 2004, the guys that we handed off from 2nd ACR out of Fort Polk said, hey, we've seen one combat wound in the year. We've had a couple of non-battle injuries. Basically, the guys in the aid station were sitting around not doing much of anything, maybe treating the stomach flu or a cough, or an old guy trying to do physical training and injuring himself. So the next day, I decide, okay, I'll jump on a convoy. I'll go down to central Baghdad with my guys, and we'll go to the green zone. And I'm in an unarmored vehicle, and I took this picture, and we're in a traffic jam, and all of a sudden your sphincter tone goes up pretty substantially, if you know what I'm saying. And not only that, as we're returning, we got on a side road, and one of our vehicles goes down. And so now you got 4 vehicles, not really combat ready, sitting on the side of a road. And my driver looks at me and says, Doc, the last place you want to be is sitting in the cab of this unarmored vehicle. Take my M16 and go set up a perimeter. As they're trying to tow this vehicle. And I'm looking at him like, do you realize I didn't sign up for this? I just signed up for the scholarship program. I mean, I'm trained to set up perimeters and fire my weapon. And just as I got out there and took a knee, a blast from somewhere in the city went off, close enough to where you could feel the shock wave. And I'm looking at myself saying, what in the world did I do? How did I get here? How did I get here? Anybody ever been in a situation in your life and you say, how in the world did I get here? I didn't bargain for this. I didn't plan for it. I don't feel totally prepared for this, but here I am, and you're trying to make the best of it. 5 days later, we have the change of command. And if you're familiar with that, it's a pretty cool scenario. Each unit cases up their colors, the new unit pulls out their colors. It's pretty neat. And that happened at 5 p.m. on April 4th, 2004, so it's easy to remember, 040404 at 5 o'clock. Well, little did we know as we went over to eat some dinner that at about 5:12, you could fact check me on that, but it's right about that time, one of our routine platoon patrols was just going out trying to figure out the lay of the land. Driving through the city and driving down an alleyway, and all of a sudden they start taking fire. And if you go back and you talk to these guys that were there, it was literally, what's happening here? You don't have a category for it in your mind. You have no understanding as to what's happening because A, we're not anticipating contact, and no reason to believe that anybody would shoot at you. Guys will say it sounds like popcorn or it sounds like fireworks going off, and after a while they realize they're taking direct fire. And in a matter of 10 minutes, their gunner, Eddie Chen, is dead. Takes a round right through the side, through the Kevlar. And they drive down a short alleyway, they take over a home and hunker down, trying to figure out what's going on and establish contact with the command center about 2 miles away. And then you start to realize that units in transition sometimes pay a big price because not only did they not know where they were going, the rest of the unit had a vague idea but didn't know exactly where they were. Some of the communications weren't fully up and operational, and all of a sudden you realize how exposed you are. So the response, when you know a guy is down in the field and you know your band of brothers is in trouble, is to do what? It's to jump in the first vehicle you can and haul in there and pull them out. And that's exactly what they did. So you had guys jumping in any vehicle they could find, driving into the city, locked and loaded, ready to go. And in about 10 minutes, we realized this was not an isolated incident, but every single route into and out of Solder City was lined with enemy fighters, and they took direct and indirect fire all the way in. And now you've got a situation where you've got multiple casualties. Never seen a gunshot wound before, right? Never seen one. And about 30 minutes later, I'm standing in the front of my aid station with a couple other doctors, and they pull in 2 young men off of a vehicle, shot through both legs, and here you go, doc, fix them up. And not only that, but every one of my 40 medics had never seen a gunshot wound before either. You train, you drill, you go through trauma life support, you do everything you know to do, but the real thing is a completely different experience. I can tell you that for sure. How'd we get through it? Well, you take one step at a time. I wanted to show you just a couple of pictures to get a sense for where we were. So this is the aid station in the aftermath. You see the aid bags up there in the top, and those are completely stripped of any bit of material and equipment that you could need. We pulled in extra supplies, extra providers, everything we could, and over the next about 2 or 2.5 hours, triaged, treated, medevaced about 63 wounded soldiers and 8 young men that won't go home. It doesn't take long to start talking about that and feel it in your gut. Spent a summer in Washington, D.C. a 1.5 years ago, and that Eddie Chen that I told you about, I got to sit next to his gravesite, and I can tell you that that takes you right back to that moment of lifting him off that vehicle when they finally got him out of the field. Young medics, soldiers who had never seen combat before, these are 2 of the best right here. And I think you can see it all over their face, what they'd just gone through. What in the world? What's going on? How'd this happen? And a couple of days later, a memorial service to give them their due respect. And now we're not at 1 accident, we're at 9 guys that aren't going home. I can tell you that was the moment when, as an individual, you look at yourself and you say, we've got 361 days left of this. What's going to happen? And about 12 days later, walking across the camp, and we heard some sort of explosion and realized that mortar shells were being fired inside the camp. And we had 13 more casualties in our aid station. Fortunately, all those guys survived. But from me to those guys in the back corner of seeing those things impact. And over the course of the year, about 1,100 mortar shells landed inside the camp. You want to picture it's about the size of a football. And it's random, it's not directed, and it'll come in just about any time of the day or night. And that's what I want to start to give you the background of the man that I want to talk about, and Colonel Gary Valesky. And I remember so many times of him addressing his men, addressing us as leaders, as soldiers, and the lessons that he imparted from that point on are the things that I really want to share with you. Well, after about 89 straight days of combat and treating casualties almost every day, things started to calm down, and so there was an opportunity to engage the community around us and get in and do some nation building. It was short-lived. This was probably a matter of a couple of weeks, and then they were back at it, really wrestling for control of this part of the city. I like this picture because I pictured, before I went on this little excursion to the sandbox, that I would get to do pediatrics. I'd get to take care of kids, and there's so many kids that need all sorts of things. And this was actually in the green zone in Baghdad, and just to get to hang out with a kid and say, yeah, this is why I train, this is why I do what I do. I figured you all would need a little comic relief in the middle of this. This is Lieutenant Colonel David Rabb. He was a combat stress commander from Minnesota. Just talked to him on the phone about 6 months ago. Hadn't talked in a long time. And I was teaching a class down in Baghdad, and this is the private pool of Uday Hussein, so one of Saddam's sons. And so anyway, we took it in and pumped a little iron at the same time. I also had the chance to do a little bit of teaching, so went in and visited with about 23 Iraqi doctors and taught resuscitation of newborns. That was pretty neat. And in the middle, I got to come back and be there for the birth of my son. And if any of you know my son, he's now 6'3". This is Levi, he just turned 15. 6'3" and still going, so that was pretty special to get to be there. And about 5.5 months later, back at Fort Hood with my wife and my oldest son there. So how do you put all this together? I've sat down so many times over the last few years and heard myself reflecting back on that experience. And even more than that, if my kids were here today, they would be able to quote a number of the things that I'm going to quote to you today. Because when you go through an experience like that, a transformative experience, and you live that, and you live under a leader like I'm going to tell you about, it kind of becomes ingrained. It kind of becomes a part of the fabric of your life. Part of the story I didn't tell you, and why there's a movie that I just played for you, is this ABC correspondent. You may recognize her. This is Martha Raditz. So Martha came over a few months after April 4th and visited with our division commander, and she said, "What story do I need to tell?" And he said, "You need to go up to Camp War Eagle and talk to the soldiers from 2-5 Cap." She did, and I can tell you we saw a lot of reporters over the year that we were there, especially as things heated up. And felt like a lot of them walked in and had an agenda. They wanted to tell a certain storyline, and they wanted to craft their story before they ever had a chance to talk to soldiers. And I can tell you that's how a lot of us felt when we sat in front of the microphone and talked to her the first time. I can tell you from this point, I've gained a lifetime friend out of Martha, and I have the utmost respect for the work that she does. She came in and really asked us to tell our story. And out of that came a book, and then about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, National Geographic picked that up and made an 8-hour miniseries, and that's what I showed you here at the very beginning. Got a chance to have dinner with Martha and our whole family about a year and a half ago on that same trip to Washington, D.C. And again, somebody who has really made a commitment to not just telling the story, not just selling a book, but in the end, she's done an incredible amount for the families who've lost loved ones in this and other conflicts. Here's the guy. Those of you who've served in the military are looking at that going, I don't see, that's not a lieutenant colonel, that's a 3-star general, and that's exactly where he ended up. So the timing of this is interesting. So now, Lieutenant General Gary Volesky is retiring from active service. I believe it's this week. They're just leaving and retiring after, I think, 33 years of active duty service. So what did I take away? There's a quote I heard a while back, and I looked for it, and I couldn't find it exactly who to attribute this to. But it was a general in, I believe it was the Marines, and was being interviewed as he was retiring, and the interviewer said, so what's the difference between the military now as compared to when you enlisted however many years ago? And you could imagine what he might say, but the quote that just caught my attention was, he said, back then we used to train leaders, and now I think we just train managers. We train people that can get things done. We train people that can stay organized. We train people that can produce a good report. But what actually is a true leader? You came here and you saw the title, and you're saying, well, lead from the front. That's interesting. Let me tell you what lead from the front means, according to then Lieutenant Colonel Gary Volesky. So we were in country, again, 4 or 5 days. We've lost troops, intense combat. And about 6 weeks later, he and his security detail were going into the city. And all of a sudden, his gunner, who's right up above him in his Humvee, starts to get sick. And this was very common there. Guys would get sick from drinking the water or dirty hands or whatever. And it's clear that this kid right above him, probably about 19 years old, can't do his job. And if you know anything about that setup, the guy who's at greatest risk in that convoy is that gunner, the one whose body's half exposed on top. Colonel Volesky pulls his convoy over to the side of the road. He pulls the young man down and he sets him in his front seat. And he himself gets up in the turret. And you ought to see, I wasn't there to see it, but I've heard the story told many times, the 20 or so young men who are responsible for his safety and for getting him where he needs to go, and they're going nuts. Sir, you can't do that. That's too risky. You can't get up in there. And he gave a one-word response, noted, stood up in the turret, took the weapon, and drove on. What do you think that did to those young men's confidence in him as a leader? What do you think that did to their sense that this is not a leader pushing us from behind, this is a guy leading from the front? He knows as well as anybody. We've already seen combat. You know that Sadr City isn't the safest place in Iraq. It was actually the biggest flashpoint in the country right then. Here he is up in the turret, willing to take one for his men, literally. We use that phrase figuratively a lot. I'll take one for the team. He was ready to do it and lead from the front. I love this second quote. This is a George Patton quote. Always do everything you ask of those you command. I would imagine, guys in the room, we've all had some sort of leadership responsibilities, some more than others. This quote challenges me every time I read it. You think about all the things that we ask of our people to do. And I think sometimes it is tempting to think, well, I'm in leadership. I'm not the guy who takes out the garbage, or I'm not the guy who sweeps the floor, or I'm not the guy who, whatever, fill in the blank. And I can tell you over and over that year, I saw a man who had every right to pull rank and never once did. Deeply impacted me. Number 3 is the story that my kids could tell almost verbatim because they've heard it a number of times. This was probably 2 or 3 months after we got there. We had a convoy of troops get hit out in the field and had, it was somewhere around 13, 14 casualties rolled into our aid station all at once. That's sort of the irony of combat medicine, is you would say, well, was it sheer terror all the time? No, it was complete boredom about 90% of the time, punctuated by sheer terror, and no warning in between. So in my role as the doctor, I'm also considered the medical platoon leader. So you're not just the doctor, you're not just the I fix up patients, but I'm responsible for the whole operation here and what's going on. And I was blessed to have another doctor serve alongside me who had had prior service and really coached me through a lot of that. But the bottom line is the responsibility comes on me for every decision that's made out of that aid station, whether I made the decision or not, okay? So we got one young man in, and I couldn't tell you the details, but it's clear he needs a surgeon, and so we're patching him up and starting IV fluids and putting on tourniquets. And I turned to my platoon sergeant and I say, we need a medevac helicopter. And the doctrine in the field is that any decision made at that aid station about 100 yards from the operations center is cleared through the chain of command. Any decision. And he understands that too. And so he calls through the talk and says, all right, we need a medevac helicopter. We need to clear this flight to come in. And they said, roger that. And in about 10 minutes, a Black Hawk flies in. We load this soldier on there. Well, about 5 minutes later, it's clear to me that we don't have one, but we have 2 that need to be evacuated out. And that was the moment where things went the wrong direction. And that is that we didn't call and clear it through the talk. And all of a sudden, another bird is flying in. I know it's coming. All my medics know it's coming. We know that this troop needs to be evacuated. But my battalion commander doesn't know. And we load the soldier on, fly him out. The dust settles. We're cleaning up, and I get a call. Doc, show up at the command center. I felt a few little jitters walking up here today. That's butterflies compared to this experience. I sat down face to face with the man that I respected the most, who has more intensity than any person I've ever met in my life. And we sat about this far apart. And he said, did you realize that at the time that helicopter flew in, we were about ready to counterfire with artillery? Did you realize that you could have cost the lives of numerous other troops? Did you realize, and I can't recite all of them because my brain was mush by that point. And he looked at me and said, that will never happen again. And there's only one answer to that, guys. That's yes, sir. I stood up to leave, and Jim, I'm sorry, I've got to touch you here. He grabbed me by the collar, and he pulled me about this close. And he said, Doc, you're doing an amazing job. Keep up the good work. Unbelievable experience. Unbelievable experience to deal with the issue without destroying the person. I mean, to yell at me, to destroy me, to destroy my career. That's the way it works sometimes. Things go poorly, and it stays with you. That was gone, it was forgotten, and as I walked that 100 yards back, boy, I knew we weren't going to make that mistake again, but I had my head high because of his leadership. Who else needs to know? I've recited this one I don't know how many thousands of times. To my family, to the people I work with. And this was in our command center, there was a big piece of paper, butcher block paper, that had been torn off, and scrawled on this was, "Who else needs to know?" Bam, on the wall. Because he realized that any decision that you make in that setting can make perfect sense to this unit, this group of 770-some troops, and they can go out and execute it perfectly. But if the 1st Armored Division that's down the road, or the Iraqi fighters that we're working alongside don't know and don't understand, it can lead to disaster. Who else needs to know? You know, sometimes in boardrooms we can make decisions and we can say, wow, we got this all figured out, but unless I communicate that to the people that are actually on the ground, that are needing to carry out my thoughts, we know that it won't happen in the way that it should. Be ridiculously positive. I tell you, it was awfully hard to be positive on the morning of April 5th, 2004. We're still cleaning up gear. We're looking at each other saying, is that as bad as this can get? Can it get worse than this? And as I walked into the command and staff meeting, hey, guys are rocked to the core. But here's a leader who says, gentlemen, we're going to win. There's no moral victories here. We are going to win this fight. And he truly believed that. And I can tell you, we jumped right on board because of the man he was. I like number 6, accept responsibility and deflect praise. I saw this 1,000 times if I saw it once from him. Hey, if something doesn't go right, it's on me. I'm the leader. I'm the guy. And when the LA Times and when Washington Post and Dan Rather and all these reporters came over and said, Lieutenant Colonel Valesky, you're the guy, we want to do a story on you, he would say, no, you don't. You want to do it on Private Smith here, who's from Arkansas, and go sit and talk to him. The opportunity to step into the limelight, take the praise, take the credit for the work we were doing was constantly deflected to the other troops that were around him. What a powerful message that was. Number 7, honor your home team. So I told you Lancer 6 was his call signal over the phone, so you're over the radio. So calling Lancer 6, I was Lancer 27, we all had ours. He referred to his wife as Household 6, understanding that his family and the operations back at home are so important for his success too. He had a son who was born significantly prematurely, somewhere around 25 weeks, and had a lot of health issues. And talk about a dad beaming with pride over his son, who may not be the cream of the crop, but man, he was his son and he was so proud of him. Put things in perspective. I remember a lot of troops as we're there for a couple of months and looking at another 9 months of combat operations and saying, is this really worth it? You guys ever asked yourself that question? Even this week, as we look at what's going on in Iraq, is this worth it? We're 15 years into this war, right? 16 years, almost 17 years in. Is this worth it? And I remember him so many times reframing that and saying, you know what, guys? We look back at World War II with a whole lot of sentimental feelings, and we like to tell the stories, and we talk about the successes and the battles won. And he said, but I can tell you that the American will at that time, leading up to World War II, was not to get into a war. The popular sentiment was, we need to stay out of it. That's Europe's problem. But guess what, guys? Looking back, no one would question the validity of our being involved in World War II. And that's the same for you guys. Hey, you're in the fog of it right now. You can't see it, but someday you're going to look back and say this was worth it. And I truly hope he's right with that. I think the story's still being written. And when it really counts, don't accept no. So my kids would tell you, if I say, look, here's what we need to get done. Hey, we can't get that done. I would say, there's a yes answer somewhere. It's your job to find it, okay? You come in, sir, we're trying to help this local hospital. We don't have the resources. We don't, they've got these problems. They've got, they don't have clean water. Doc, there's a yes answer somewhere. You and your men find it. Never once did I feel like he was asking me to do the impossible. But did he ask me to do the hard, the difficult? Absolutely. And did that stretch the guys that served under him? Absolutely. That sure did. But there's a yes answer somewhere. Oh, did I say lead from the front? I think that was number one. Probably 6 weeks after we got there, I was sitting in a command and staff meeting with Colonel Valesky, and we were talking about something, and as a doctor, you notice things. And what I noticed was something I'd never seen before, and I was thinking, well, I'm responsible for his health. There's something strange going on his face, only the left side of his face. And it was these little circles, and I thought, that's an interesting rash. I better figure out what that is. Honestly, going through this mental, okay, what is it? What's going on there? And as I got a little bit closer, I sat and I realized what it was. Anybody know what it was? What's it? Bell's palsy. It wasn't Bell's palsy.
CPAP mask?
It wasn't.
Okay.
No, good guess. Shingles, good guess. It wasn't. One last guess. Yeah. So when a commander rides in his vehicle, in his Humvee, he has a driver on the left side. He sits in the right hand. When a commander discharges his weapon, his M4 in his case, he's firing with his left arm outside his window. And as the hot shell casings kick out, they flip up and hit his face on the left side only. If that's not leading from the front, I don't know what it is. Here's a guy who had every opportunity, had every bit of rank to sit in the operations center, watch on a computer screen where his troops were in the field, and over the radio order them to go here, go there, engage the enemy here. And instead he turned to Martin Dannett, Major Martin Dannett, and said, Martin, you're going to run the operations center. I'm out with my boys. Unbelievable. Unbelievable what that does to the guys that are serving with him. You know, as they were making that movie, there was a lot of chatter. I talked to a lot of the guys that were on the set and helping with it and so forth. And there's a line from the movie that guys picked up on. And this is Hollywood for you. The two troops talking to each other. And the one said, if I knew there was, you know, one chance in a million that we would make it through, I would follow you. I would follow him. Speaking of Colonel Valesky. And the guys all responded and said, we knew there was no chance that we were going to make it through, and I'd still follow him into anything he told me to go into. That's leadership, guys. I mean, really, leadership isn't a title. Leadership isn't your credentials. Leadership isn't your pedigree. Leadership isn't your money. You're a leader if people will follow you. And I've never seen a better example in my life. 15-year perspective, right? Was it worth it? How's that experience impacted me? I think that story is still being written. Am I a different guy than I was before I went there? Absolutely. Well, I've been shaped by a lot of other things too, not the least of which is raising 6 kids. That'll keep you honest, right? That'll test your leadership skills just about any day. Ups and downs of work life, family life, all those sorts of things. And the thought I want to leave you with is a verse that you're probably familiar with, Jeremiah 29:11. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is that this is a verse that I think is taken out of its context in a very interesting way. Those of you who are going to maybe attend graduation parties this year, you'll find plaques, you'll find cards, you'll find anything plastered with this verse. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. Awesome. That's exactly what I need to know as I go off to college or get a job. God, He's got my back, right? Things are going to be good. I think you could read that verse and say, well, life is good. God's in my corner. It'll be all right. But if you really look at that story, I'd encourage you to pull it out today and read it. Read the chapter or two ahead, and it puts it in a very different light. So what's happened is the Israelites have been invaded. Their best young men have been carted off to a foreign city. And that's the context of the book of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. This is all in that context. These are young, healthy, phenomenal men who are pulled out of their comfort zone. And the Israelites are saying, what's with this, God? Aren't you on our side? Aren't you in our corner? Aren't you going to take care of us? And all of a sudden, prophets start to rise up in Israel, and they say, hey guys, not that big of a deal. This is going to be over really soon. Not that big of a deal. Pretty soon, all these exiles will be returned. We'll rebuild the temple. Life will be great. You'll get your property back. You'll get your home back. Telling them what they really wanted to hear. Hey, I would have taken a one-way ticket back from Baghdad on April 5th, okay? Actually, I wouldn't have because I was serving under a guy I didn't want to leave, but that's aside. I think a lot of us would have, right? But in the middle of that, Jeremiah says, hold on. Ain't going to be over very soon. In fact, this is going to last 70 years. This exile is going to last 70 years. In other words, a lot of you will never see your homeland again. You're not going to see it rebuilt. Not what they wanted to hear. It's going to last 70 years. So go ahead and inhabit houses. Let your children intermarry. Plant gardens. Do whatever you got to do. Make the society better. You're in this for the long haul. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper and not to harm you. Plans to give you a future and a hope. That promise comes in the context of more adversity than most of us will ever see in our lifetime. And yet it's absolutely true. Future and a hope. And I don't know where you're all at. I know that life has its major ups and downs, at least. Lost my mom 11 years ago to Lou Gehrig's disease after a lifetime of missionary service. That didn't make sense in my brain. God, why? I know the plans for you, to give you a future and a hope. God's in our corner, pulling for us in the middle of the adversity. So I don't know what nugget you're going to take away today, but I hope you understand that God doesn't candy coat things. God doesn't sugarcoat things. God doesn't make our lives easy. I sincerely believed before I went to Iraq that God would keep me from having to even go over there. Yeah, I know everybody's going, but I'm not going to have to go. No. You're in it for the long haul. It felt like 70 years while we were there. I know the plans I have for you. Thanks for the chance to share today.